Hi, I'm Mallory, and welcome to Lakunaloff Speaker Series. We're really excited to keep this program going. We've had one every month now with various topics, always with young adult cancer in mind. And I'm really excited to welcome Robyn today, who will talk about some research that she's been doing about cancer survivors and the workplace. And we have some questions submitted by the community afterwards, which is exciting. So Robyn, go ahead, take it away.
Okay, so I was diagnosed with breast cancer about 5 years ago, and I was a single mom living in a state where I didn't have disability insurance, and I worked for an employer that didn't offer disability insurance, so I quickly made the decision that I was going to work through my treatment because I didn't really have a choice to do anything else. But it turned out to be a pretty good decision because it helped me get out of bed every morning and go somewhere and feel like I was doing something each day. And I found that very helpful for me and was fortunate to have been healthy enough through that process and have fewer side effects that I was able to do that as well. My employer was very supportive and I was able to do whatever I needed with flexible scheduling and things like that, which was really great. I scheduled my chemo on Fridays with this great idea that I would feel great on Mondays. And in hindsight, I probably would schedule my chemo on Thursdays, and because Monday was probably my worst day. But it ended up working out, and I actually made it through my surgery, chemo, and radiation using 8 sick days and 7 vacation days, and which worked out really well because I ran out. Fortunately, at the time I ran out and my radiation ended, my anniversary came along and I got all new sick and vacation time. So that was really helpful. But at the end of my radiation, I was getting very exhausted. That was when I really started slowing down, and I started working Mondays and Tuesdays, taking Wednesdays off, and working Thursdays and Fridays. So Wednesdays I used sick time or vacation time during that time, and that was a really helpful strategy for me. On my last day of radiation, I returned to work and had a weekly management team meeting, and they had planned a celebration for me. They had a cake, and we all celebrated me being done with my treatment, which was fantastic. I just had felt so supported through my treatment, but the problem was, although my treatment was over, I probably felt worse than I did throughout my entire treatment at that time. I was so exhausted. I was suffering from anxiety, particularly around the time when my appointments were happening. And it took me a while to realize that that was happening, and that helped get it under control to just, when the anxiety creeped up, just go, oh, I have an appointment in 2 weeks. That's why, and could get through those weeks. But I had chemo brain. I couldn't think and respond the way I used to, and I found that I was being excluded from meetings because I wasn't contributing like I had, and I was getting extremely frustrated during that time. The timing coincided with the rollover of my paid time off, so I decided I needed a vacation at that point, and I took a little bit of time off and tried to refuel. I continued taking Wednesdays off until I felt stronger, but some of my colleagues were growing more and more impatient with me, and so that continued to be frustrating, and I was trying to figure out who I was now and what my life was going to be. So over the course of the next 7 months, my work environment became increasingly unpleasant, and I ended up taking a leave of absence in January of 2014. And from there, I decided not to return to my position. Although it wasn't the best financial decision of my life, fortunately worked out for me. It was a really pivotal time in my life where I was able to develop that roadmap of where I wanted to go and get started in that direction. And I spent my days skiing. I live in a ski town, so I spent my days skiing. After skiing, I went to hot yoga, and in the 105-degree high humidity room, and I sweated out, or I visualized myself sweating out my chemo out of my brain. And every day that I went through that, I felt more clarity coming back. And every day I became more focused and realized I needed a change. So through skiing and yoga, I decided to quit my job. And so I developed this vision that I would start an HR consulting firm. My background has been in human resources, and that was something that I knew I could do, and I could do on my own time. And I began making plans to start a practice. And I realized, though, that I needed insurance, and that if I worked part-time, I would also be able to stretch my savings longer, making it more likely that I would be successful, because I didn't have much left after paying medical bills and things. So I found a part-time job at our university, which helped me accomplish that. So I worked part-time doing human resources, and was able to get insurance with that. So that worked out really great. And during that process, I learned how or what the requirements were to be a non-tenure track faculty member, and that with my master's degree I could teach, which I wasn't aware of before. And I always wanted to teach the human resource class at the university. And so I went in and applied for that, and was able to teach that class, and then was asked to teach some other classes, and all of a sudden I was teaching full-time and wasn't really consulting. And so I changed my direction a little bit there, but it turned out to be a really positive change. Through teaching, I became interested in research, especially when I heard that 33% of working age cancer survivors were exiting the workforce within 5 years of their diagnosis. And I was concerned about that, because at 2 years, 90% of working age cancer survivors were back in the workforce working. So something was happening between year 2 and year 5. And for me, at 18 months, that was when I just was done and needed something different. So I wanted to uncover what was happening there in between year 2 and 5, and started looking into that statistic. So what I found was there were a lot of studies on why people stayed in the workforce, but not why people were leaving. So that became the focus of my research project. But the reasons people are staying or returning to work, these are probably not going to be very surprising to all of you. But there was a desire to keep things as normal as possible in their lives, and having something that was some stability there. That was 44% of the participants in that study indicated that. 53% said they were feeling well enough, which means 47% weren't feeling well enough, but they were forcing themselves back to work, which I think is really important for our society to understand, that just because treatment is over does not mean you're 100% again. And your new 100% might be something entirely different. And for some people, it's something entirely different in a positive way, and for other people, it's not. And we need to understand that. And so my goal with my research is to get that message out there, so that employers are being a little more understanding of what happens after we're done with treatment as cancer patients. So going back to the statistics, 70% were back to work because of financial concerns, and they needed to be there. Surprisingly, of people that are exiting the workforce, what this study showed was that they were of the lower wage earners, and they needed to be in the workforce more than others, really, but they were stepping away. So again, from a societal standpoint, this is a concern to me. So I wanted to do research of my own, which I started over this summer. So my preliminary findings on why cancer survivors were leaving the workforce included 16.5% leaving for reasons for personal self-fulfillment, whether going to another position where they felt they had some sort of higher purpose or more meaningful work, spending more time with their family. Some people just wanted to volunteer and give back in different ways. 43% left because they didn't feel well enough to go to work on my study. And that in many cases, they requested what sounded like reasonable accommodations, and they were denied them. And so they didn't feel that they had the ability to work. So that area is of huge concern to me, because employers should be helping their employees transition back into the workplace. 40% indicated that there were some sort of workplace issues happening, including harassment, failure to receive a reasonable accommodation, and not feeling valued in the workplace as reasons that they left their current employer. Some barriers that I uncovered, which won't be a surprise, I'm sure, were things like lack of coworker or employer support, feeling that in the workplace, the job demands being too much. Maybe they were in a physically demanding job and they couldn't keep up anymore and they needed to do lighter duty work. The cognitive dysfunction that takes place. They had depression, fatigue, chemo brain, and then cancer-related post-traumatic stress, which I was really happy to find out that was a thing and it was real, because I was experiencing that. So part of my mission is to explain those barriers to employers so that they understand what that really looks like. Because unless you've really been impacted by cancer in your life, people don't really know what those side effects are, and they don't understand because their friend Susie went through it and everything was fine and she didn't even miss a day of work, or different things. And we all, I'm sure, have heard those stories that come up that we don't want to hear because we want to have our experience. So helping employers understand that everyone's experience is different is really important to me. So the cancer-related post-traumatic stress, like I said, I was really excited to see that that was real, or related to cancer, because I started having severe anxiety. So I think employers need to keep aware of the signs of that and be helpful and supportive in the workplace in there. Chemo brain, of course, is a real thing, and people don't realize that. And I am so often asked when I tell someone I'm a cancer survivor, that almost every time someone asks me, is chemo brain a real thing? And they're annoyed with someone they worked with that was milking the system. And it takes everything inside of me to not just scream at them about it being real. And so that message, I think, is really important. And I think it's important that people understand that, yes, it's frustrating to talk to someone with chemo brain, but it's frustrating for that person too. And the way I describe it is that your mother-in-law came to visit and moved everything in your kitchen and you're trying to find it. That to me is what that feels like. There was a study that I was introduced to recently that an individual found a set of twins in which one had cancer and the other didn't. And they were able to study the brain power that's required to do certain tasks after chemo with essentially two identical brains, because they were identical twins. And it was really, really interesting to see. And I'll try and get a picture to you, Mallory, of that, because it shows simple tasks where just a little tiny bit of someone's brain who's not experiencing chemo brain versus the enormous amount of work our brains were requiring to do very simple tasks. So that part was very interesting to me, and I'm looking at finding out more about that research study. Other research studies I've looked at that support the need for the research I'm doing included looking at quality of life and work. And there are studies that show that the more a person is able to work during treatment, the better their quality of life is. And I think back on my personal experience of getting up in the morning because I had to go somewhere. And that in itself just started my day. Whereas on the weekends, or that Wednesday I was taking off, I would stay in bed. If my children were with their dad, I would stay in bed until my dog came up and started dragging me out of bed and um, things. So work, it's not only important financially for people to be back at work. If they have the strength to do it, it will help it improve their quality of life just from a mental state. And so another really important issue in my mind of why employers need to be more supportive in there. That 15, although most employers will say they find having a plan to deal with insurance or to deal with cancer in the workplace is important to them, only 15% of those employers actually have a plan. So getting a message out again to employers to have a plan so that employees feel comfortable going to someone and asking for help is kind of a part of my mission right now. And so to me, it's like creating an environment of inclusion before people are diagnosed, training employees before people are diagnosed. So it's not like, oh, Robyn has cancer, so we're going to do sensitivity training, but letting people know from the beginning, this is a part of our culture to support our employees and to help them through. And so an example of that for me, I mentioned I worked in human resources and I knew benefits. I'd been a benefit administrator in a different position, and I knew benefits inside and out. And when I was looking at my benefits to understand my insurance, I struggled. And this is stuff I could spout off in my sleep. And so I started thinking about, imagine being an employee working in another part of the organization. You go to benefit orientation, they tell you a whole bunch of stuff that, particularly when you're young, you're never going to need or use. And they don't know their insurance inside and out. So with that struggle that I went through with all that knowledge, I realized employers also need to be more proactive, so that if someone comes to you or comes to them and says that it discloses their diagnosis, that we go back over the insurance with them. We go over the benefits we told them, whether it was yesterday or 5 years ago, and what those benefits are, and help them through the process instead of making assumptions. So that part is really important to me as far as making employees feel like they have someone to go to. That part to me is just extremely important. Insurance is so incredibly complex, and I live in a rural area, and I have a great cancer center here, though. It's kind of surprising the care I received. I was very happy. But what I found out was my radiation was not in network here. So I was diagnosed in October. I met my out-of-pocket maximum in November. My insurance renewed in January. January 4th, I met my out-of-pocket maximum again. And now I'm being told I need to meet a third out-of-pocket maximum because my radiation is out of network. And I had to think about it. And again, knowing I know insurance and I know how this works, still had to put a lot of thought in it, and realized I could write an appeal. And I did. And I explained driving 90 miles in the snow daily for radiation was not anything reasonable at all. And I was able to win that appeal. But I ultimately made the decision to start my treatment regardless of that and figure it out, because I knew I couldn't do that drive and work. So just really wanting to make sure, in my mind, a new mission in my mind is to make sure employers understand that employees going through cancer or any major medical, they need help with that insurance beyond what we normally do. In my study, organizations that had outsourced HR had the worst service they were providing to their employees. And you had people that were struggling and having difficulties calling, and they'd get a different person every single time they'd call and have to start at the beginning every single time. So somehow fixing that problem is also really important to me, because I spoke to a lot of people that had that impact to them. So kind of that whole mission is that employers become more supportive to their employees, and I come up with a model where they're going to first, by just showing some compassion and that they care first off and listen to their employees, and to offer assistance in, don't wait for them to ask, what are my benefits? Don't assume they remember they have disability insurance or other benefits, or that they understand they can take a leave of absence. Let them know what those are. So offer assistance and be proactive. That ties into that. And then educate employees and managers so that if an employee discloses this, that they can be supportive from the get-go. And so that's a little bit about me, what my research is, kind of where my passions are. Now I'm looking at, I teach so much, I don't have time to work on other things as much as I want to. So I'm thinking of switching my consulting firm around to a nonprofit to get some grant money and hopefully be able to spend some of my time supporting people who are going through cancer and have questions or just need assistance during that time. So
I'm just sitting here listening to your words, just like I feel myself nodding and smiling and connecting with so many of the things that you talked about. Yeah, I will kind of launch straight into the questions. I found it so interesting, your description and the statistics that fit it about how people seem to feel, at least sometimes, supported during the diagnosis, but not after. And it's that afterwards period where people are exiting and having the most issues.
Yes. And I think there's just a frustration with the recovery.
All around.
All around, definitely. And which to me is why that quality of life statistic is so important, because it's kind of, and I haven't taken physics in a really long time, but I think of it as, so things that stay in motion, or things in motion tend to stay in motion. And if we're sitting at home not using our brains, our chemo brain is not going to go away. And I really attribute teaching and my chemo brain going away. I see that working together, because when you're standing up in front of a bunch of 18-year-olds and you're trying to recall facts, you better find them. You know, wherever they got remapped, they need to come to the surface. So I think that was really helpful. And the more we're using our brains, the more we're working, the sooner it goes away. And I'm finally thinking, or feeling rather, that my chemo brain is dissipating and I'm not struggling as much. It's strange. There are words that I cannot pronounce for the life of me anymore. And it's weird and frustrating, but I'm able to retrieve facts now, and it feels really good to get back to that point. And for me, it was 5 years. Studies show it's anywhere from 2 to 10 years. Wow. So for some people, this goes on for a very long time. And what are they not supposed to work and have, aside from the financial side that is so important because we have to survive, keeping our insurance, but just from the meaning that it brings to so many people to be doing something during the day. It's important. So
yeah, gosh, I have so many things to say, but I will launch into the questions. What rights or protections do employees who are returning to work after cancer treatment have in the workplace? How are these rights impacted if FMLA was exhausted? Right. There are lots of questions in this one.
Yeah.
How might one go about researching what rights protections are available to them based on where they live or the type of company they work for? Because this was the clincher for me? Like this, someone like literally, it feels like they pulled this question out of my brain, because that was like not knowing what rights and protections I had, and having kind of a resistant person above me to like figure that out, and to admit any sort of like to admit that there were any sort of issues going on that like that might, you know, make me a different sort of employee, was like basically the reason why I left my previous kind of career path.
Yes. And you know, your experience is something that I plan on pursuing further to look into that.
Thank you. It sounds like someone else has had a similar issue
with that. But this is, and there are a lot of parts, so to this, but it's a difficult question to answer, because we have federal law, and then states have their own laws based that have to be more generous to the employee. That's the good news with state law, is that they can't take away any of our rights, they can only enhance them. So one thing is, where do you work? Then you have to look at what size is your employer, and you want to look at size in a few different ways. You want to look at size in the sense of how many employees do they have, because that determines what laws apply to you. And then you want to look at size and what resources they have, and how much revenue they generate, because that impacts what's considered a reasonable accommodation. So I have to say, I can speak generally about the law, but I'm not an attorney. And if you feel like your rights have been violated, really the best thing for you to do is to find an attorney to give you legal advice within your state, where you've shared your entire story with them. So, and if that is a route you need to go, you want to make sure you're finding a labor attorney, and possibly, depending on the size of your community, a labor attorney that specializes in disability would be your best bet to help you. So, based on those multiple questions this individual asked, it sounded like they were eligible for FMLA. So they worked for
which could you maybe describe what FMLA is?
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah. So FMLA is the Family and Medical Leave Act, which means that if you're entitled to up to 12 weeks of job protected leave if you work for an employer with 50 or more employees in a 75-mile radius. And yes, I have worked for a company that I had a map of the United States with all of the retail stores on there with little circles around to see which ones qualified for FMLA. Was not anywhere I ended up staying, because that just was, if someone, you know, was 76 miles outside of that radius, they would not get FMLA, where someone very close by would, and that bothered me. Always in my career. So the company I went to after that, we also were a national firm, and we would extend leaves. It wouldn't be FMLA, but it would be a leave with we'd offer the exact same rights and privileges under FMLA to any employee. So if they were in Illinois and we had one employee in that middle of that state, we gave them this leave, just because that's the right thing to do, you know. But anyway, so this gives you that time off. It's unpaid, but what it does for us is it allows us to continue our benefits as if we were working. And so what that means is, if you have health insurance through your employer and you pay as an employee $150 a month, let's say, and your employer is paying $350, they have to still pay that $350, and you still only pay $150. So that's a huge benefit right there.
So you don't get paid, but you still get all the other employee benefits that you were given.
Yes. So provided you have to return. If you don't return, they can charge you and send you an invoice for what they paid. have not worked for an employer that has done that, but that's within their rights to do that. So it's important to know that. And, unfortunately, the message is there that if you know you're not going to return from a FMLA leave, go back for one day and protect yourself. I mean, it can be worth thousands of dollars, So anyway, so that leave, when you return from that leave, you have to, you have to present medical certification to take the leave, and then that you are able to return. And they have to return you to the same or similar job, provided that job would have been there had you not taken the leave. So there are some exceptions to just definitely getting your job back. So for example, if you had failed to comply with a supervisor request and you were being insubordinate in the workplace, and then said, oh, and by the way, I got diagnosed with cancer, I'm going out on this leave. When you come back, they can deal with that insubordination and they can deal with performance issues. It's very difficult when an employee goes out or requests a leave and they've been having performance issues that you've been addressing, and when they come back, you have the right as an employer to continue to address those. If an employee comes back from a leave and starts having performance issues, maybe caused by chemo brain or other things, then that's different, and that would be something covered under the ADA, which we can talk about. So performance issues are really the main thing. Or if an employer was planning on having layoffs and someone requested a leave during that time and that person was on the list to lay off, then you have the right to eliminate that position as planned. So there are some exceptions to it, but generally if you can come back to full duty, then they need to put you in the same or similar job. There was a question about if it was once FMLA is exhausted, right?
Yes.
Okay. So once FMLA, you have 12 weeks of this protected leave. If you can't come back, generally the employer will can consider you to have kind of resigned almost, because they're not really, it's kind of questionable who's the moving party. Are you being fired, or are you just not able to work? And if you can't return from a leave, you're considered not to be able to work. And so they don't have to hold your job. They can write you, send you information, or I'm sorry, they don't have to hold your job, and you can, they can essentially terminate you, with termination not being a bad word, but the ending of employment at that point. And as I mentioned, you could be asked to pay your medical premiums back at that point if you don't come back. So what you can do under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you can request a reasonable accommodation, and the courts are starting to consider extended leave as a reasonable accommodation, which employers are just getting really frustrated with, because that's not an accommodation to help them work. But in reality, it is being considered that, because if that additional time off can help the individual recover more so that they can return to normal work, then it is a reasonable accommodation. Because the whole idea behind the employment portion of the Americans with Disabilities Act is to help people get back to work and help them be able to work. So either be able to through a reasonable accommodation, or take more time if needed. So if you request more time and it's granted, what you need to understand is it's not a family and medical leave, so your insurance does not have to be continued, and they can send you COBRA papers, which allows you to continue your insurance for up to 18 months. In this case, you would be disabled because you didn't return to work, and it would be up to 36 months. But under FMLA, the scenario I used, you were spending $150 a month and the employer was paying $350. In this case, you'd be paying the $500 in this example a month for your health insurance. But I think we can all agree $500 a month is worth scraping up when you're spending the amount of money on healthcare that you have to do.
Well, and now too, with the Affordable Care Act protections, which are still in place, people like no longer having a job is considered a life change, and so it opens up a special enrollment period, and so people would be able to apply. And if all of the tax stuff is potentially changing, but all of the premium assistance is still there, so that's also a great thing now. I know that wasn't the case yet when I was taking off my parents' insurance and still going through follow-up scans and things, and so I paid Cobra for 36 months, and it was worth it, but very expensive.
Yes. And one thing to keep in mind with, because when I left, the Affordable Care Act was in place when I left my employer, and I was offered Cobra when I left. And if I had accepted Cobra at the higher premiums and then started researching the Affordable Care Act in the marketplace for a better rate, what I would have to keep my Cobra till the open enrollment period, or till my Cobra exhausted. So it's a big decision that people have to make after another big decision either was made for them or they're making, and it's hard.
Yeah, very quickly too.
Yes, definitely. So very, very glad that those protections are still in place.
Listening to a talk like this and listening to such valuable insight from you is really important. And then people also need to just realize that they will figure some of this stuff out as they go if they need to. And that talking to an HR person, talking to a social worker, Googling some of these exact questions into, like putting some of these exact phrases into Google, these questions, there really is, you just got to start poking people. And if someone doesn't know, make them find someone who does.
Yes, absolutely. Don't let them say that, especially if it's your employer. They need to find out. They need to help you. And
I think the key piece of information is that there are these rights and protections. Because if you don't know that, then you're kind of hosed. But if you know that there's something out there, just go ask.
Yes, definitely. And so I'll share some resources with you to share on your website to direct people to some really great websites that can help explain that information.
Absolutely.
And find someone, if you're, I don't know, for me, I was in shell shock for so long. And, a friend came with me to my appointments and she just wrote down everything the doctor said, because I just sat there and I had no idea what he was saying. He could have been speaking a different language, no idea at all. And she transcribed them for me, and I could always refer back to them while I started getting anxious and things. It's like, oh yeah, I'm going to be okay. Okay. I just have to do this, and it's the same with all of these laws. They're complex. And if you're not familiar with them until you're put in this stressful situation, it's going to be difficult to understand them and understand how they apply to you. And you have to look at the federal law, but then you also need to look at the state law. So, for example, under the federal law, employers, it impacts employers. The Americans with Disabilities Act impacts employers with 15 or more employees. In the state of Washington, they have a more generous law, and it's, employers that have 8 or more employees. In California, it appears to be 5 or more employees, from what I could find out. And in Montana, this will surprise you, 1 or more employee. And I don't think that Montana is where you look for more protection for employees, but they're there, and
in
it's
this case,
pretty amazing in this case. Yeah, yes. So So knowing even that number, like I can share it's 15 or more, because this is a national service that, so to speak, that you provide. So you have to look to your state. And a great way to find out information is to put in your state name and write labor posters. And that's a way to bring up just some preliminary information. So then you might not get all the details you need, but these are the posters that should be up in your break room with your employer. But a lot of people don't like to look at them there because it's obvious you're upset about something when you're looking at the labor posters. But you can find them online, and then you find the name of the laws in your state, and you can further search from there to find out the little differences from federal law.
So we kind of went through one of the questions. We just have a couple left.
Okay.
What do you think cancer survivors should keep in mind when trying to decide whether to leave their pre-cancer career or find another one?
Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. I kind of took a less than planned route with mine, and had I put too much thought in it, though, I probably would have never left. So finding that balance, I think you need to really understand why it is you want to leave and what it is you're looking for. And that has to be that first decision you have to make, or the first realization you have to make, rather, of what it is you're trying to leave and what it is you're looking for. Because maybe it's just your employer and you want to go work for another employer doing the same thing, but maybe it's the job and the day-to-day part of your job that you need something different. So you need to figure out what that is first. You need to look at insurance. Unfortunately, the thought of being, for me anyway, the thought of being uninsured is terrifying. And so you want to go on the exchange and look at, what is this going to cost me out of pocket? Because they're not going, and here's where a lot of people are mad about the Affordable Care Act, because they feel like they've been deceived. And really, what happens is they go online and they apply for insurance and they say, I'm unemployed now, so I'm going to put my income in as zero. And really what happens to get that tax credit is they look at the earnings you've made throughout the year as well. So
the whole year picture.
Yeah. So if you make $50,000 a year and you're doing this in June, you need to say you make $25,000 and assume you'll be unemployed. And the other thing you need to do is, once you become employed, is realize that now all that income is going to be reported. And at the end of the year, when they calculate that credit, you might have to pay it back if you were only unemployed for a few weeks and now you're making more money and things. And people don't understand that. So that's the other thing, is understanding your insurance, what those costs are going to look like, and making sure you have the ability to remain insured. Maybe you have a spouse, though, and you can get insurance on their work, and that's a real easy fix. So financially, often when we're pursuing our passions and things that are more meaningful, that often means a pay cut. And researching where it is that you want to go and what that pay scale is likely to look like in your community. And there's a website called onetonline.org, and you can put in positions there, and you can drill down to your state, and I think you can drill down to the county. It's about a year or two behind, but it gives you averages and what the median wage is in there. So you can really do some research of what it is you can expect to earn, and make sure that that's sustainable in your community and where you're living based on the cost of living. And that, sometimes you give things up. So I haven't had cable TV since I left my job. I have my Wi-Fi, of course, my internet, but I don't have cable. And I gave that up. That's $100 a month. And what are you willing to give up in that change, and just how much risk is in there? So for me, being the only source of income for my family, going to a startup where there's high risk wouldn't be a really good move for me personally. But you want to take those things into account. So the risk of where you want to go financially, can you do it? If it's starting your own business, how much money do you have in your savings to sustain until you're turning a profit? For me, working part-time to get the insurance worked out really well for me. But those to me were the most important things to think about in hindsight. Having some sort of plan before you walk away from your current income, I think, is important. Finding out when you'll get insurance with your new employer as well. Under the Affordable Care Act now, it has to be 90 days. Prior to that, it could be a year before you get insurance, depending on your employer. So you want to find out what those benefits are going to look like where you're going and make sure they're going to work for you.
Yeah, great advice. And then the last question, someone has submitted this every time, which I think is fun.
Okay.
How did you find Lacuna Loft?
Oh, okay. So I found Lacuna Loft through my research project, and Mallory was a participant in my study, and so this time she's reversed the tables on me and interviewing me instead of me interviewing her. And it was really wonderful to see that such a great resource is out there for people. So, okay.
Thank you so much, Robyn. This has been great. Is there anything kind of last that you want to add or send people with? We will definitely post those resources, and I will let people know kind of where to find them.
Okay, great. And if I can add to that the link to my survey in my research project, because I'm going to continue collecting data until probably June of this year. So
that's wonderful.
I would love some more participants.
And she's a very loving person to talk to on the phone about this very emotionally charged subject.
Yeah. We can cry together.
Well, Robyn, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to kind of finding out, what you find, the results that you find from all of this. So hopefully maybe you'll stay tuned with your results.
Absolutely. I will share those with you as well for you to share for yourself and your members, because hopefully can make a difference for someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Robyn.
Thank you. Bye-bye.